I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today we're discussing cortisol, in particular how to control your cortisol in order to avoid burnout, or should you already be feeling burnt out, how to overcome burnout. Now, it's hard for me to overemphasize just how important cortisol is. In fact, in the late stages of preparing for this episode, it dawned on me that if ever there were an episode of the Huberman Lab podcast that people could benefit from in terms of their health and well-being, this would be that episode. And I say that because, as you'll soon learn, cortisol, the biology of it, how it impacts your mood, your sleep, your immune system, your overall feelings of well-being, not just in the moment, but over the long term, and your ability to control cortisol at different portions of the day and night, makes it one of the most, if not the most powerful levers for your health and well-being. So I'm very excited to get into the material for today's discussion about cortisol, how to control it, and how to avoid and overcome burnout. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, today's episode does include sponsors. Okay, let's discuss cortisol. Now, I believe that most people have heard of cortisol, and most everyone that hears the word cortisol hears it somewhere nearby the word stress. And it makes sense why you would hear about cortisol in that context, because indeed, cortisol is a hormone that's made and released in response to stress. Now, the problem with thinking about cortisol simply as a stress hormone is that it's doing a lot of other things unrelated to stress that are super important and positive for you. However, it all depends on how high your cortisol levels are and when. So during today's discussion, there's going to be a very prominent theme, which is your cortisol rhythm, or more particularly, your 24-hour so-called circadian rhythm in cortisol. And here's the important first thing to remember. You want your cortisol high early in the day, shortly after waking. And you want your cortisol low in the hours right before sleep and in the first hours of sleep. If you remember nothing else from this episode, please remember that, because if you get those two things correct, everything else in terms of health and wellness and performance, all of that will be reinforced by getting your cortisol rhythm correct. So today I will explain how to get your cortisol rhythm correct. I will also explain what stress does to cortisol in the short term, which turns out to be good for you, and in the long term if you're dealing with long bouts of stress associated with what eventually becomes burnout. So it's also important for me to point out that if you're already feeling wired and tired and burnt out, if you don't have energy in the morning, or if you somehow have low energy all day, but then at night you can't sleep, this is very typical of burnout, or if you have morning anxiety, literally all of that can be resolved, perhaps not entirely, but mostly, and in some cases entirely, by fixing your cortisol rhythm. Okay, so to understand and control your cortisol, the first thing you really need to know is that cortisol, again, is not a stress hormone per se. Rather, cortisol is involved in deploying and directing energy to tissues that need it most. Okay? I'll say that again. Cortisol is not a stress hormone per se. Cortisol should be thought of as a hormone that causes the deployment of energy into the body and helps direct that energy to particular tissues, especially your brain, in order to deal with, yes, stressors, but all sorts of other things that demand your energy. So, the way to think about cortisol is that it causes the release of glucose, blood sugar, into the bloodstream. And it does that by controlling energy release from the liver and from the muscles. But cortisol is not made in the brain. Cortisol is made in your adrenal glands. And of course, the adrenals are associated with adrenaline, also called epinephrine. Those are the same thing, by the way, epinephrine and adrenaline. And your adrenals will release epinephrine, aka adrenaline, in response to a stressor very quickly. Your adrenals can also release cortisol in response to a stressor, but it needs to make that cortisol first and then release it. So cortisol acts on a slightly slower time scale to deal with stress. And as I mentioned before, cortisol isn't just about stress. Cortisol is also about generating energy to deal with pretty much anything that requires energy. So when you need energy to deal with stress, to deal with getting out of bed in the morning, to deal with a hard school task, work task, relationship task, drive your kids to school, whatever, cortisol needs to be released. Okay, this is a very different mental framework around cortisol than we're used to hearing. We normally hear elevated cortisol, I'm releasing cortisol, my cortisol is too high. You need cortisol released in order to get glucose, blood sugar, into the bloodstream. Now, cortisol is unique compared to, say, adrenaline or norepinephrine because cortisol is what's called lipophilic, meaning because cell membranes are lipid, fat, and cortisol is lipophilic, it can move through cell membranes. And what that means in the functional context, what it means for you, is that cortisol is released from the adrenals, circulates in the blood, just like adrenaline would. But unlike adrenaline, it can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it really likes to do that because there are a lot of receptors for cortisol in the brain, in particular in a region of the brain called the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. Now, we'll come back to the hippocampus later because the hippocampus is vital for understanding what happens during situations of chronic stress and why cortisol can be dysregulated under conditions of chronic stress. But for the time being, let's go back to thinking about cortisol simply as a mode of releasing glucose into the bloodstream. Cortisol releases glucose into the bloodstream. Much of that glucose is going to be directed toward brain energy so that neurons, nerve cells can use it to think and to deal with whatever happens to be confronting you during your day, good or bad, stressful or non-stressful. So one of my biggest wishes for today is that you, and hopefully the rest of the world, will eventually come to adopt the understanding that cortisol is not a stress hormone. Yes, cortisol is involved in stress, but cortisol's main job is to deploy energy. It's an energy-producing hormone, in particular, a brain energy-producing hormone. I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Carbon. Carbon is a diet coaching app built by nutrition expert Dr. Lane Norton. Now, I've used Carbon for more than 3 years now, and I have to say, having been interested in fitness and in my nutrition for more than 3 decades, it's among the most powerful tools for nutrition coaching and effective weight management that I've ever encountered, especially if your goal is like mine, which is to maintain or build muscle while also losing fat. Now, I'm turning 50 years old this September, and even though I consider myself in pretty good shape, and I've been training for a long time and trying to eat right, one of my goals is to hit 50 in the absolute best shape of my life. To do that, I'm dialing in my nutrition using Carbon with the goals of increasing my muscle mass, increasing my strength, while also decreasing my body fat. I've been raving about the Carbon app to friends and to family and to members of my Huberman Lab team over the last few years. And everyone who's joined me in using it has found it to be tremendously useful. In fact, some of those people are going to join me in my approaching 50 fitness goals and body composition goals. My birthday is September 26th, and so I'd like to invite you to join if you would like to improve your body composition and fitness to also use the Carbon app. Now, there are a lot of apps out there that are focused on fitness and nutrition, but what makes Carbon different is that it doesn't just hand you a one-size-fits-all plan. It actually learns your metabolism over time, and it adapts your program based on your results. It also allows you total flexibility in how you eat. If you're plant-based or you're keto, high carb, low carb, anything in between, or even if you switch back and forth between different diets, Carbon works around your preferences. The other thing I love about Carbon is that it easily adapts to whether you're the type of person who likes to put in the specific brand and the exact number of ounces or grams of food that you ate, or if you tend to be a little bit looser about that, like you ate half a handful of almonds or something like that, it can learn and adapt to that and still give you accurate recommendations. So if you're looking to take a smarter, more personalized approach to your nutrition, I can't recommend the Carbon app enough. To try Carbon, you can go to joincarbon.com/Huberman. While Carbon does not typically offer trials or promotions, they've agreed to give a free 7-day trial to all Huberman podcast listeners. Again, that's joincarbon.com/Huberman to get a 7-day free trial. Today's episode is also brought to us by BetterHelp. BetterHelp offers professional therapy with a licensed therapist carried out entirely online. I personally have been doing therapy for well over 35 years. I find it to be an extremely important component to overall health. In fact, I consider doing regular therapy just as important as getting regular exercise, including cardiovascular exercise and resistance training, which of course I also do every week. There are essentially 3 things that make up great therapy. First of all, it provides the opportunity to have a really good rapport with somebody that you can really trust and talk to about essentially any issue that you want. Second of all, it can provide support in the form of emotional support or directed guidance, or of course, both. And third, expert therapy should provide you useful insights. Insights that can help you improve in your work life, your relationships, and in your relationship with yourself. With BetterHelp, they make it very easy for you to find an expert therapist who you resonate with and that can provide those 3 benefits that come from expert therapy. Also, because BetterHelp therapy is done entirely online, it's very time efficient and easy to fit into a busy schedule. There's no commuting to a therapist's office or sitting in a waiting room looking for parking, any of that. You just hop online and you do your session. If you'd like to try BetterHelp, you can go to betterhelp.com/Huberman to get 10% off your first month. Again, that's betterhelp.com/Huberman. Okay, so just a couple of minutes ago, we were talking about how cortisol needs to be high in the morning, shortly after waking, and low in the nighttime, and certainly while you're asleep. Except for, as it turns out, in the final hours of sleep, you actually want your cortisol rising. So we need to take a step back and ask, why is cortisol released? When is it released? How is it released? Because understanding that gives us control over cortisol at any time of day or night. So rather than just list off a bunch of things that you can do to increase your cortisol or decrease your cortisol, which I'd love to do, frankly, but the problem with that is if I do that, it doesn't take into account that your levels of cortisol are constantly changing across the 24-hour cycle. So if you don't understand that endogenous 24-hour rhythm in cortisol, not just knowing that it's high in the morning and lower at night, if you don't understand how that's regulated, you won't know which protocols, which tools to apply when. But if you can understand how that rhythm is generated and how cortisol is released in response to short-term events like stress, but also the desire or need to exercise, the desire or need to focus, if you can understand those things, how cortisol is released in the short term and across the 24-hour cycle, how it literally regulates itself, then you will have immense control over cortisol across the 24-hour cycle from day to day and from moment to moment. Okay, cortisol is a corticosteroid hormone. Yes, it's a steroid hormone, just like testosterone is a steroid hormone, just like estrogen is a steroid hormone. Steroid hormones are derived from the molecule cholesterol. And there are a bunch of biochemical steps that take you from cholesterol to cortisol, or from cholesterol to testosterone, or from cholesterol to estrogen. Scientists have long known that cortisol is not at the same level throughout the 24-hour day. In fact, there's a quite classic study now that examined the 24-hour pattern of the episodic secretion of cortisol in normal subjects. And what they found is that there are essentially 4 phases of cortisol levels. I'll just read off what these different phases are. Phase 1 is a 6-hour period of what they called a minimal secretory activity, meaning when cortisol is not released very much, that starts 4 hours before and continues until 2 hours after lights out for sleep. Okay? Starts 4 hours before and continues until 2 hours after you turn your lights out to go to sleep. The second phase of cortisol, in which the levels are quite different than in the first phase, is a 3-hour period, which they called the preliminary nocturnal secretory episode, but we can simply call the 3rd to 5th hour of sleep. So in your 3rd to 5th hour of sleep, you have a second phase, and this phase they called the preliminary nocturnal secretory episode. And this is when cortisol is slightly starting to rise, just a little bit. In the first phase, cortisol is very, very low, or ideally, you want cortisol very low. So this is under normal, healthy conditions. In that first phase, the 4 hours before until the 2 hours after lights out, cortisol is going to be very low, and it's going to stay low. And then in the second phase, it's going to slightly rise into the 3rd and 5th hour of sleep. Then in phase 3, which here is listed as a 4-hour period, but the exact duration is going to vary, you have what's called the main secretory phase of cortisol. This is when cortisol is increasing very, very fast. And this occurs, believe it or not, during the 6th, 7th, and 8th hour of sleep. Now, you might say, I only sleep 6 hours, so do I get that fast rise in cortisol? Guess what? You don't. If you sleep 7 hours, you only get a portion of that fast rise in cortisol. If you sleep 8 hours, you get the full duration. And if you sleep 9 hours, yes, your cortisol will continue to rise. So the idea here is that in the very final hours